Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to fellow chairpersons, board of directors, ladies and gentlemen today. Welcome to Bursa, Malaysia. We are honored to co-host today's event on the Masterclass on Managing Scope 3 event. It is a collaborative effort together with Climate Governance Malaysia. On behalf of Bursa Malaysia and CGM, we are thrilled and very honored to have all of you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, board of directors, chairpersons, sustainability advocates, sustainability leaders, we are about to begin. I hope you had a wonderful time networking earlier today. I hope you had good food as well. To kick off our session today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this insightful masterclass. Please join me in welcoming Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, the chairman of Bursa Malaysia Berhad, to give his welcoming remarks. Tan Sri.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning, distinguished chairman, chairpersons, board members, corporate leaders, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking Corporate Governance Malaysia for joining us in hosting this event this morning. We are especially thrilled to have many of you this morning. By our standard for this masterclass series, this is a good turnout. I was there at the ASIS Circuits Commission a month ago, attending a similar masterclass series, and I think the attendance was probably half of this. But anyway, I think it's important for all of us, members of the board, to embark on this journey of continuous learning so that we can deal with climate issues effectively at the board. Now, to Climate Governance Malaysia, special thanks to you for bringing over Mr. Benjamin McCarron to our office here this morning. Now, I just had a conversation with Ben. It's ironic that Ben was here some 12 years ago to talk about sustainability. Now, after 12 years, he's now back here, so it's very much a homecoming, obviously, to Bursa Malaysia. Again, welcome back, Benjamin. Now, when it comes to climate change, I think we've seen a lot of evidence already right in front of us. Now, this issue has been spoken about for years, but it wasn't until 2015 that the whole world came together to commit to the Paris Agreement and to commit to limit the increase in temperature to within 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level by the turn of the century, meaning by 2100. Now, this was followed by a series of commitments made over the years and at various successive conference of parties. And the next one, as you know, starting in Dubai, COP28 this first day. Now, for me personally, climate change was something new to me. Although I've been keen on conservation, I did not realize the full scale and extent of it. Yes, as someone who was young then, I used to go to a beach resort in Kelantan, Kota Baru. It was called Perdana Beach Resort at Pantai Cinta Berahi. The name wasn't Syariah compliant, so they changed it to Pantai Cinta Bulan now. But the point is, at that point in time, during low tide, I could walk 400 meters to the water's edge, right? But today, the whole seafront is actually already eroded, and it's gone beyond the road side. Now, last year, I had the benefit of visiting Antarctica. So you're probably wondering why this photo was actually shown here. Now, again, I've seen a lot of reports talking about climate change and increase in temperature, sea level rises, and so on. But I wanted to see it for myself. How real, how does it look like? So there's nothing, I suppose, more evident when you go to the ice world, so to speak. And in Antarctica, so my wife and I booked the expedition to Antarctica last November. Now, I must say, it cost a bomb. We were supposed to change our 10-year-old or 12 years old Velfire last year, but we felt that between changing the Velfire and going to Antarctica, so okay, let's defer changing the car and go here first. Now, this was when I witnessed for myself the severity of the receding of the glaciers. So you can see that, of course, I mean, we were not there when, many years ago, but some of the scientists who were on board the ship told us that those glaciers' age was actually all the way to the water, and now it's receded well actually beyond that. You saw that. And then as we were sailing, we saw this floating ice with 4 penguins, right? Now, the 3 penguins in front, they are smaller Gentoo penguins. They rose to a height of about 2.5 feet, or 30 inches, or 75 centimeters for those who are used in metrics. So they are small and they are native, they are abundant in this area. But the guy at the back, the black-colored guy, is the bigger emperor penguin. Now, emperor penguins grow up to about 1.2 meters, so that's about 4 feet in height, to about 40 kilograms in terms of weight. And it's black, it's dark, it doesn't have that orange foliage because it is still a juvenile, right? But the thing is, he wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't his habitat. So the closest emperor penguin colony is on a Snow Hill Island, which was on the other side of the Antarctic Peninsula. So the scientists were telling us, look, this is actually another evidence of global warming. It's actually real because it disrupts the behavior of wildlife and so on. So the point here is actually, look, there's enough evidence about climate change and how harmful it can be. And what we need to do is to truly commit ourselves to combat climate change so that we can, at the very least, save a better future for our future generation. So indeed, this is where all of us will play a role. So at the national level, we all know that more than 90% of the countries making up 90% of the economies of the world had already committed to be net zero in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century, 2050 or 2060, and that included Malaysia, that committed to be net zero as early as 2050. And to do that, all of us will have to collaborate together at the industrial levels, or surely at the corporate level. Many of us have already committed to be net zero. And I think likewise at the individual level, we must also do the same thing. Malaysia's commitment to climate action is not made in isolation. Across the globe, investors and consumers are demanding environmentally responsible practices, international agreements and regulatory shifts, including the upcoming COP28, reflecting a paradigm where sustainability is no longer optional. Now, aligning our strategies with these global commitments not only fulfill our responsibilities as corporate citizens, but also position us to competitively in a rapidly changing market. Now, Malaysia as a nation is likely to succeed when there is a collaboration to prioritize climate risk reduction and when climate action benefits and burdens are shared equitably. And in navigating the intricate challenges of climate change, a whole-of-nation approach is required to build a greener, more sustainable and resilient economy. And government policies like the National Energy Transition Report, the upcoming nationally determined contributions plan that's coming up, and as well as the long-term low energy development strategy low emission development strategy, LTLEDS, are certainly steps in the right direction towards a low carbon economy. So I think it is important for all of us, Malaysians in particular, to understand how we are going to get to net zero as early as 2050. So I think we had that net energy transition report, and upcoming will be the NDC roadmap and the long-term low emission development strategies. Without looking at those roadmap, it would be very difficult for us to appreciate the actions that we have to take and how much will that impact the emissions leading up to net zero. Now, on our part at Bursa Malaysia, we like to believe that we are doing what we can. I think, first of all, when it comes to corporate reporting, our sustainability framework, we had issued that in September last year, and that will come into force effective from 2024 or 2025, depending on whether you're in the East market or in the main market. Now, as you know, we have also launched the Bursa Carbon Exchange. Now, the idea is actually not to circumvent efforts to reduce your emissions, but the idea would be, as corporates, as businesses commit to be net zero, to reduce the emissions, there'll be times then it will take a lot of effort and investment required, and therefore, while you're attempting to reduce your emission, one thing that you could do is to be carbon neutral immediately by purchasing carbon credits. Now, the proceeds from the purchase of the carbon credits will go to entities that will embark on projects that will reduce the emissions, whether it's actually technology-based or it's nature-based solutions, but it will help. So that's why we embark on the development of the Bursa Carbon Exchange. We started with two projects overseas in Cambodia and China, not because we want to promote overseas projects and so on, but that's because we don't have a Malaysian project which has been verified and validated. But that's coming. I think, God willing, next year we will have some local-based carbon credits to be traded on our exchange. Now, another effort that we are doing at Bursa Malaysia is to create, develop a decentralized sustainability intelligence platform to enable public listed companies to disclose their ESG data in a standardized manner. Now, enhancing data credibility and ultimately simplifying communication with other stakeholders such as financiers of the various decarbonization projects. Now, the idea would be not just to have that CSR platform for Malaysia. We also signed up with Thailand and Indonesia, and Dr. Omar and the team will be in Dubai next week to expand that collaboration further. So the idea will be, hopefully, we'll have a platform that will be more standardized and embraced by many of the other exchanges around the world. Now, I think this where, as we all embark on our respective mission and roles, it is important for all of us as board members to also play a pivotal role. Now, in terms of our strategic direction, the questions that you ask to management at the board meetings and various engagements, and your decisions certainly will have the power to shape not just the business outcomes, but the environmental outcomes that we desire to. Now, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as chairman or as chairpersons, sorry, Dr. Amy, we always get, don't take us as being sexist and anything like that. When we refer to chairman, we mean it universal. So it's not meant to refer to any particular gender. Just like we talk about mankind, not necessarily just to talk about men and womankind. So anyway, as chairpersons and board members, our decisions ripple through time, shaping the legacy of our organizations. And together, we can set a new standard for sustainable leadership, proving that profit and planet can coexist harmoniously. And the time for action is now, and the responsibility rests upon our shoulders. Now, today is also special in the sense that we have this initiative by the World Federation of Exchanges, where we would like to get everyone to join us to ring the bell for Climate 2023. Now, this is a global statement of our commitment to better climate governance. A reverberating ringing of bells symbolizes a call to action for each one of us, echoing our commitment to shaping a sustainable and resilient future. And let's answer this call with resolve and determination. So what I would like to do after I end my speech, we would like to ring the bell from our respective tables as our call for action for Climate 2023. So with that, thank you for your attention. And sorry I've taken a bit more time, Benjamin, from your session afterwards. But I hope it's been a useful engagement, and I look forward to listening to the presentation and to continuously engaging with you afterwards. So with that, thank you and have a productive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, and as what Tan Sri has mentioned earlier, there's a small ice cream bell in front of each of you. We would like to commemorate to this event with a small round of ringing the bell as a symbolic gesture. This is an initiative by World Federation of Exchanges around the world. This is to draw attention to significant issues pertaining to climate change. In the count of three, let's ring the bell together and give your best smiles to the cameraman in front. If everyone can stand for a while, ring as hard as you can on the count of three. Just remember, this is the ring the bell for Climate 2023. On the count of three, 1, 2, and 3. All right, I think the last time we heard the bell when we wanted to buy an ice cream, when we were a child before, right? Okay, thank you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Going back to our core agenda for today, we are honored to have with us Mr. Benjamin McCarron, founder and managing director of Asia Research and Engagement, who will lead today's masterclass on the title of Managing Scope 3 Emissions. Allow me to pass the floor to Dr. Sarinder, Council Member of Climate Governance of Malaysia, to continue moderating the event and provide a brief introduction of our esteemed speaker for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Afik. Distinguished guests, Tan Sri, thank you for that very warm welcome for this masterclass series. And you're right, the turnout today is much better than many of our previous masterclasses. And I think the credit goes to Bursa Malaysia. You know, Bursa Malaysia is a regulator, compliance, so everybody is here. And I think, Tan Sri, your presence here definitely made a difference to the turnout for sure. Thank you. I think as Tan Sri shared in his experience with the Antarctica, climate change is no more a distant threat. It's no longer a distant threat. It's a reality that businesses must face head on. Chairs of boards, I was very careful to say not chairmans, chairs of boards have a critical role to play in ensuring that their organizations are prepared for the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents. The Climate Governance Malaysia Masterclass series is designed especially for chairs of boards and directors who want to deepen their understanding of critical climate-related issues. These masterclasses help provide the board with the knowledge and tools they need to make informed decisions. This will not only help their organizations become more sustainable, but also increase their resilience to climate-related risk and create long-term value for their organizations and their stakeholders. We have had 5 sessions to date, and today is the 6th session. We would like to thank all the sponsors who have made this possible. We thank Bursa Malaysia, Securities Commission, FIDE Forum, IOI Properties. We also thank ICDM, who have been a huge supporter of this program all along. The topic for today's session is managing Scope 3 emissions. Given that Scope 3 emissions are not under the direct control of companies, managing these emissions poses a challenge to companies. To help us enhance our understanding of this subject and how to navigate the management of these emissions, we have with us today Mr. Benjamin McCarron, who will speak to us on this subject. Let me give you a brief introduction of Mr. Benjamin. Benjamin is the founder and managing director of Asia Research and Engagement, or ARE, which is a Singapore-based social enterprise with a mission to catalyze corporate change through investor-backed engagement. ARE's vision is to achieve a sustainable and compassionate Asia for future generations. The company brings leading investors, representing more than $7 trillion, into dialogue with Asian-listed companies to address sustainable development challenges. Concurrently, Benjamin also holds an ambassadorial role in Asia for Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, or GRESB, the leading tool for rating ESG for real estate portfolios. He has written extensively about sustainability in Asia since moving to the region in 2011. His report, Banking Asia's Future, covers the approaches that leading regional banks are taking to address climate change. He has published 4 blue books with CLSA covering animal proteins, palm oil, climate change in Malaysia, and how to create an ESG framework. He was also the Malaysia and Thailand chapter author of the ACGA's biennial CG Watch publication. Benjamin is a regular speaker on sustainability and responsible investment in Asia and has been interviewed and quoted for major international and Asian publications, including Financial Times, CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, SCMP, The Independent, The Observer, Business Times, and The Age, among others. Without further ado, I now call upon Ben to give his presentation. Ben, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the warm introductions, Tan Sri and Dr. Surinder. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I first came to Bursa, Malaysia. I actually spoke in this room 12 years ago at an event, and then I've sort of come through the years, but not since before COVID. So yes, it is absolutely a welcome back here, and I'm delighted on that. And I'm also delighted to be working with Climate Governance Malaysia. So actually, I'd met Sunita at an event back before 2019, it must have been. So she invited me to come and be a panelist at the launch event back in May 2019. So it's wonderful to be reconnecting with both organizations after a few years stuck down in Singapore and traveling less across the region. Having said that, Scope 3, the part that's outside of our direct control, I slightly feel I might have got the short straw from Sunita when she offered me this one. We have, thanks to our Ring the Bell, we've obviously got a very awake audience today. After that, I wonder if we can also have an interactive audience. It would be great if those of you who have tried within your organizations to push for some kind of Scope 3, could you just raise hands? Let's get a sense from the room. Has anyone tried? Oh, okay, so it's a few. All right, so a few. So some have started the journey and others are yet to come. And would anybody who's started the journey like to just share an observation of how that has been? Is there anyone who would like to, just one or two little words? How has Scope 3 been?
Morning, Tan Sri. Morning, Mr. Benjamin. It is a compliance requirement according to Bursa's framework, but that's effective FY 2024. However, in 2023 itself, we have applied the 2 categories 6 and 7 out of 15 categories. Basically, employees, commuting, and business travel. That's the easy ones.
Okay, that's the easy ones, but only 2 out of 15. Okay, there's a clue there. Any other sharing briefly from the floor on initial experiences of Scope 3?
Thank you very much, everyone, for having us. My experience has been slightly tangential. I was asked to train 1,000 vendors of a top-tier public listed company in Scope 3. As I mentioned earlier, it was the steep side of the mountain to climb. Why are we being disturbed from doing business by having to attend these classes was generally the comment. The majority of them had no clue why they were there and why they needed to comply. Of course, they did appreciate the training. However, the traction was very weak. Thank you.
Okay, 2 big clues there, or 3 really. So 2 out of 15, so quite a wide range of issues. Huge training for a large number of suppliers and nobody quite sure why they're doing it. Are there other people in the room with similar experiences? I can see some nodding heads. Sure.
Thank you. Well, I guess we all face the same issue about data transparency and reliability when it comes to emissions, scoping and putting a number to it. And then the other thing is also end-of-life product disposal. I mean, that falls under Scope 3. So if you don't have the infrastructure to do the end-of-life recycling or reuse, right, so that's going to be a real issue as well.
Thank you very much. So there we're hearing about another of the categories that we're going to come to in a moment. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And we'll come to some of the other tables perhaps later as we go through. Quick housekeeping. The slides will be distributed to you. They'll be made available. I guess it'll be Climate Governance Malaysia. We'll distribute them later. So what we're going to focus today, where we hope to get to, is that by the end, there'll be an understanding of Scope 3 emissions, some sense of all 15, and whether and how they may be relevant for your business. And then we'll look at what a good plan looks like, so a bit about the destination, and then some of the steps for developing a plan. But because Scope 3 means so many different things to different businesses, and there's so many different scopes, within 1 hour, we just simply can't get through absolutely everything, all right? But if you are finding, hang on, there's something specific that you need clarity on for your business, please do come in, particularly in the Q&A section. And one thing, so then, sort of third thing that we're hoping to provide for you is just a few resources. One is to look at supplier incentivization. And the other, because many of you are board directors or chairs, a few questions that you can ask to hopefully bring your company, bring your management team, or even the sometimes very harried sustainability team along the journey with you. And the order of the presentation and the sharing: what are Scope 3 emissions? Why act? Then we've got a range of case studies. Depends how long it takes to go through those, whether we do all of them. And then we'll look at some of those resources towards the end before moving into a full group Q&A. We've already had a few examples of Scope 3 emissions. We've heard employee commuting, business travel. We've heard end of life. We've heard a bit about suppliers. Any other examples of Scope 3? Any other examples? Okay. Oh, I should define it. Sorry, I assume people know it, but let's just take one moment. So scope 1, that's emissions basically if you burn fossil fuels directly. Scope 2, somebody's burning immediately on your behalf. Scope 3, all other value chain emissions, not in your direct control. And it's that not in your direct control that makes scope 3 so challenging. But at the same time, if you're in an industry with a lot of emissions and the economy is going to net zero, then the whole value chain for that industry needs to come down to scope 3. So the industry is going to have to go on a journey together, whether that's power, whether that's cement, whether that's auto, the whole industry is going to have to move together. So if you've just got one narrow slice and you only look at that, you're not seeing the full picture. And now we will go into the 15 categories of scope 3. I'm going to have this slide up a few times in various formats. Purchase goods and services. That's where you buy from somebody else raw materials. Capital goods, that's where you buy the capital, the fixed assets, as opposed to just the raw materials and the goods. Fuel, we'll have a look, sort of somebody burning fuel somewhere in your supply chain. Transport and distribution, it comes up twice. So that side's upstream, this side is downstream, so if they're distributing to you or if you're distributing to somebody else. Waste, I think there was a waste solutions company that's here today. Business travel, employee commuting, leased assets again, you can be leasing from somebody else or you can be leasing to somebody else. So on both sides. And then these ones about sold products, we've already heard about end-of-life treatment, but there's use of sold products, leased assets, franchises, there's 7-Elevens out there, and then finally investments. So quick question, which of those do we think are perhaps the most important, generally speaking? Where do we think the most material, the most emissions are generally happening? Would anyone like to hazard a guess? Category 11, use of sold products. That's absolutely critical for oil and gas, yes. Any other suggestions of some of the most important scope 3 emissions? We haven't heard from that table. Number 3, fuel and energy related activities. Absolutely, across value chains. That's a huge source of emissions. Any other guesses? Transportation and distribution is critical. Okay, so there's one other which we're going to come to where most of the scope 3 emissions for the examples that we're looking at are going to come from. It relates back to what the gentleman was talking about earlier, the suppliers. So we'll look at that. But I'd like to look at that through the framework and the lens of an investor. So this shows Allianz Global Investors wrote a publication, it's called The Power of Three, looking at what are the most important scope 3 issues across different sectors. And we've put it up there for you today. So they talk about material issues. Now, so excuse me, the advantage of putting on the glasses is that I can see everything. The disadvantage is I can't walk quite so easily. But utilities, metals and mining, construction, IT, consumer services, healthcare. We're going to ignore the scope 1 and scope 2 parts and look at scope 3. So first thing to note is that all of them have a lot of scope 3. So dark blue is very material, mid blue is mid-material, and this one is less material. So scope 3 is important or very important for all of these sectors. And then we can look, so these are the sectors and they're aligned to the previous page, same categories. And so what we see is actually number 1 for all of these, and number 11 are the ones which are coming up very frequently. So number 1 and number 11. Purchase goods and services, the suppliers. Oh. The suppliers are absolutely critical. And then here, use of sold product, also absolutely critical. That came up, the oil and gas example is a very, very good one, not just for oil and gas. And then also this one here, investments. So investments is for financing. So for any banks in the room, the financed emissions. Or for any institutional investors, also financed emissions. So if you're in a private equity firm, any listed, if you've got a holding portfolio with a lot of different companies, then it's that one there. That's why Allianz has got to write on these topics, and that's why ARE exists, actually. We are working with investors to help them manage down the financed emissions that they have from their portfolio companies. You could even argue Bursa, the emissions of all of the companies listed on Bursa. Sort of scope 3. Sort of scope 3. Okay, so these are the more important ones. What about the easier to collect? Which are the easier to collect from this list? Six and 7, absolutely. And we slightly put in waste as well. It's a little bit harder, but waste is somewhat under control. Actually, when we come to the example of Hewlett-Packard in just a moment, what you'll see is that they basically group these as operational emissions. So we've got this disconnect, haven't we? That the ones which are easy to do are not the ones which are most important, unfortunately. I thought it would be really helpful to have a look at a value chain example and see. So I don't want to go too far into the technical details of how it's all added up, but just a sense of how to think about emissions across the full value chain. Coal power. This is pretty easy. This is a mining company, and the mining company emits 5 tons of CO2. That's the fuel for its diggers and its trucks. That's the emissions that happen while they're mining. And then they obviously mine coal, and that coal, when it's going to be burnt, the emissions associated with that coal are going to be 100. This is a very easy number example. This is not a real life example, obviously. So for the coal company, they use 5, and downstream is going to use 100, use of products sold, a bit like the oil and gas companies that were mentioned earlier. And note here, the total, 105. I'm going to ask a question in a moment. If it's 105 and that's the value chain emission for the mining part of this value chain, what's the emissions going to be for every other part of this value chain? Let's see. So the coal goes to the utility company, it's burnt in the generator. The generator obviously emits 100, that's their scope 1, they're burning it. And then there's the scope, there's this 5 from the mining company. Comes up to 105. And this, actually, somebody did mention category 3, all of the burning and the fuel and the wastage that happens of the energy along the chain. Then it gets to transmission. We've got a distribution loss. We lose 10 effectively going through as it's transmitted from one area to the other. Then it sort of becomes a little bit technical how to apportion that scope 3, but key point, still 105 when we add it all up. And then finally the customer only gets 90 at the end of the day. So the total is 105, customer gets 90, that 15 represents a loss across the value chain. So hopefully this also makes it clear how it's this number that when we think about an industry needs to be reduced. It's the total value chain number. Yeah, but why? Why should we try and reduce it? Does anybody have a particularly strong why that they'd like to share? Anyone want to hazard something? Bursa made a rule, that's one. But do we have any others? Bursa might make it a rule in future, that's two. But do we have any stronger whys? All part of the ecosystem. So here hopefully is a well-synthesized why. Risk, opportunity, responsibility. The business case reveals itself when you start to act. Why is that? It's actually a bit like what the gentleman shared at the back. It's a steep learning curve. You don't know what you're going to know at the end of the learning curve when you start. It's only as you start action, you start finding, oh, I spoke with that supplier and there was some innovation that actually can reduce costs, but they can't do it because they need a bit of financing. Oh. So it's only when you really start to make efforts, make investments, that you can realize the value. But let's look. So risk, the world has changed. Actually, as I was preparing this talk, I have to say, I was quite surprised by how far many businesses have come, not just in Europe, but in Asia over the last few years. And we're really at a point now where if we don't act, we're going to get left behind. So that's a challenge. And the other thing is, if you're making investment decisions and not thinking about scope 3, in the years to come, in the next years, maybe decade, those decisions could really come to cost you. So we need to be thinking, designing in these sorts of issues now, not waiting. And then, as already mentioned, understanding your value chain helps you to create a better strategy. And from a responsibility perspective, we're all directors, we're all later stage in our career, we can think about legacy, contribution to the world, whether that's for family businesses or for GLCs. Clear moral case now. And different stakeholders, there's different benefits. So for customers, they might want to see your low carbon products. For suppliers, if you invest in the supply chain in different ways and they can reduce costs, they can give that back to you later with better pricing. And for the banks and investors, they're looking to support, we're going to see some concrete examples, looking to support companies that are moving. It's not just a simple, oh, we're going to divest if you're too high. No, no, no. There's an intention to support along the way. And finally, for many organizations, I know I've seen employees can be very motivated by a stronger sense of meaning and purpose. I wonder if that's something you also see in your organizations. Perhaps that's also why you're here today. But we can't distinguish the why from the how. And there's a challenge in the how. So we know what a good plan is going to look like. A good plan is going to have a baseline. We're going to have reduction targets with clear timelines. It's going to be linked to 2050 with an interim 2030. And then there's going to be an action plan for those targets. That's what it's going to look like. That is a good plan. We're going to see some good plans in a moment. Unfortunately, it's really hard to put in a good plan. Steep learning curve, the data. How many of you have found that ESG data, generally speaking, is hard to get? Has any of you found that it's easy to get? Maybe we should know. Nobody's found ESG data easy to get, especially all of those SMEs. Okay, so never mind data's not available, it might not even exist, right? Solutions, they might not be economically feasible. There's no alignment on disclosure, and even worse, whenever you have conversations with the suppliers, it's a combative negotiation. Like, you can't imagine that you might cooperate on anything, given price-oriented negotiations. So that is a real, let's not kid ourselves. Those are the challenges. Yet we have to overcome them if we're going to get through the net zero transition. So we have to communicate, we have to find ways to cooperate, and we have to iterate. So you don't have perfect data. Okay, well, do you have anything, even a contextual, some range, somewhere, maybe a data provider somewhere has come up with a model. Okay, put that, start, good. Start. Have a conversation with the supplier. Is it the first time they've heard about Scope 3? Maybe it's the first time they've ever heard about this. Okay, fine, educate them, right? So all of the early steps are about putting engagement plans in place, how to speak to the suppliers, hopefully building their why so that they know why they're there, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. It's a journey. But I want to bring the journey to life with some examples. And hopefully these examples illustrate many of the points. I've started with Hewlett-Packard. We all know printers, computers. Also, my wife works at Hewlett-Packard, so I think she was quite happy when I put this as the first example as well. So here we are. Nice disclosure in line with the 15 categories. That one at the beginning, materials. This one here, product use. That's what the disclosure can look like. Hewlett-Packard has a net zero value chain emissions target by 2040, and then they want to reduce half by 2030 against 2019 baseline. So this is what yours might look like. Yours might look very, very different. Different sectors have different charts. And then we've zoomed in on the second one, the use of products, for this slide. Basically, on the left, what they show, they actually put that, this is in the sustainability report, right? It's really great to see. This is the decline in the energy consumption of their personal systems products against the 2019 starting point. So actually, the negative number in desktops, if you can see it, it went the wrong way. But for everything else, it's gone the right way. There's been a decline in the energy intensity. Now, actually, for printers, we probably don't think about energy efficiency of the printer, but we would think about it for white goods, maybe fridges, and we'd certainly think about it for air conditioning units, right? Already, consumers are thinking about energy efficiency. That's because of the pocket. That's not because of the carbon. But here, it's both, really, but a bit more carbon. And here are the kind of things they're doing. So they've got Energy Star ratings for 90% of their products. They've reformulated their black toner. Everybody knows the black toner, right? That's reformulated, so it takes 20% less energy for it to stick on the page. Then different, removing moisture in different ways, again, in order to accelerate that printing. These are the kind of investments that they're looking at continuously to drive down the emissions associated with the use of their products. So I'm going to cycle through a whole bunch of these examples. Are there any organizations here that are in Unilever's value chain some way or another? I guess palm oil, or even sort of retail, any? Okay. So I included Unilever mainly because of the palm oil. So here what we see, raw materials, 49%, plus packaging materials, together 61%. So for them, it's all of that upstream, all of that education of suppliers. And in their case, they've got so many different commodity lines. So what did they do? They set out greenhouse gas emissions roadmaps for all of them. And within that, they've committed to zero deforestation for key raw material inputs by 2023. So they're really trying to drive through cleaning up of that supply chain. We all know in Malaysia what that's like on the palm oil sector, so I'll unless somebody wants to specifically ask about that, I'll move on from that one today. The other thing that they have, transform to net zero. I have to say, I mean, I didn't put a visual in here, but when I look through the website, they've got an online tool which goes into every part of the strategy, why, what, how. Actually a really interesting, useful resource for managing supply chain and working with. One other thing, product design. So, are people aware that meat, dairy, animal proteins have a lot of scope 3 emissions? Were people aware of that in the room? So when we eat meat, there's a lot of, the feed comes from the Amazon a lot of the time. Okay, so Unilever's approach to that, expand the plant-based business. So they want €1 billion of annual sales from plant-based products. That's actually interesting here. Nestle Malaysia has got a major investment in plant-based here. Good, I can see some nodding around the room. So that's an example of where this kind of thinking about high impact supply chains creates innovation, creates new product opportunity. All right, switching sector quite markedly now, Volkswagen. Autos. I found this really quite interesting and instructive as I was reading their sustainability report to put this together. So here we have another sort of display of the 15 categories. And of course for auto, it's all about use of product sold, right? That's the main thing. So over 70% of their emissions. So how are they going to manage that down? Well, two strategies. One is a few extra, improve the efficiency of petrol cars. That's one strategy. But the other strategy, the most important strategy, is electrification. So yeah, today, if we switch and there's a lot of coal on the grid, maybe emissions are equivalent. But the electric vehicles, the emissions can come down. The petrol cars, they can't come down. And this has redefined Volkswagen's strategy. I was actually positively surprised when I read through. So they're investing $52 billion in electric mobility out to 2026. In 2022, 7% of their sales were electric. In 2023, target is 11%. By 2025, target is 20%. That is really moving fast. Actually, if you look at China, the acceleration of electric vehicles is even faster. My colleagues, we have a subsidiary now in China, and my colleagues out there are saying, hey, it's quite quiet now in Chinese cities because all of the cars are electric, not so many. But what's fascinating is they're also building out a battery supply chain, and they're building out all of the charging points. I know in Malaysia, the charging point infrastructure has been something that delayed the implementation. In Germany, they're building out huge numbers of charging points, and they've got a whole new business where they're selling renewable energy. They're creating huge investments in renewable energy as well, and then they can sell that through the charging points. And if people aren't using their cars, then the stored energy in those vehicles can be used to help support the grid. And they want to, that's going to be a new revenue generator for them. So it's a total reimagining of the industry and the value chains, and VW stands to make an absolute fortune out of doing it. On the right, we can see the fleet vehicle emissions for new cars for Europe and the US. And I put them in there because it links to another example that we'll see later. Switching topic. Okay, this is the investments version, right? CAT 15. This is ING Bank. Don't try and read the data, that's not the point. The point isn't that you can read the data, the point is that they've got the data. And what is the data that they've got? They have gone through across their business lines, and they have identified by business line what are their financed emissions. And for their wholesale, and they disclose it as well. So for the wholesale, they've banking business, that's their emissions by sector. So list of sectors, outstanding loans to those sectors, and then associated financed emissions. And their objective, manage it all to zero. Primary lever is working with the companies that they're financing. Secondary lever, step away, effectively. And I should just mention one thing. Today, this is scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So they've also got a data problem when it comes to scope 3. But they're intending to move to scope 3 emissions as soon as possible. And actually, some of their targets relate to scope 3 emissions. So that's in Europe. What's happening in Southeast Asia? Or I should say, really, in Asia. So DBS. DBS was the first Asian bank to come out with a suite of sectoral targets. So they came out with targets for I put them at the top there, targets for power, oil and gas, automotive, steel, aviation, real estate, shipping, food and agri, and chemicals. A whole suite of targets. These are some targets for power. and then we put the Japanese ones as well. The developed market banks in Asia all have things like no financing of new coal. That's stopped. And here they want to see financed emissions from the power sector declining. The Japanese banks like to put a range. For the Singaporean banks, they tend to put a line, a point estimate rather than a range. So these are there. Again, two levers: helping clients decarbonize, asking them to put a plan in place, and then moving away if they don't think that the plans are credible. Put in another example from DBS. This is on auto, right? So their target is it's the efficiency, effectively, of the vehicle fleet of the company that they're financing. So this here, which is Volkswagen, when they sell new cars, how efficient is their overall new cars? Are they electric vehicles? Are they very efficient petrol cars? That, which is scope 3, is also what DBS is focused on. So DBS is not focused in the auto sector in scope 1 and scope 2. DBS has said, we've got to support businesses that are pushing into electric vehicles. We've got to support businesses that are changing the value chain rather than just being efficient in their own factories. So here we've just grabbed the data from the report. Basically, grow with clients that are better positioned, increase financing across the EVs, and support the clients. Support clients, particularly important for SMEs. And then finally, our very own CIMB. I know CIMB is not in the room, but some others are. This came out sort of last week, so I thought it would be nice to put in this example. And this is an interesting example, cement, because cement, the low carbon cement, really expensive, really hard to do. So this isn't something that can be achieved overnight, right? So it's really interesting, I thought, how, so this is the, what CIMB's 2030 target against, there's this thing, SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is how to set a credible transition target in line with global pathways. I'm not going to go too much into unpacking that unless it comes up in the conversation. But key point is that CIMB is looking for clients to manage down the efficiency, the CO2 efficiency of their cement production. And that I thought it was really interesting, this point 3, one of the ways they're going to do that is they're going to speak to their real estate clients and ask real estate clients, how are they buying in green cement? Please, real estate clients, you need to manage down the scope 3 of new buildings. That means that you need to buy green cement. You need to help the cement supply chain. So I thought that was a really interesting example and relevant. Maybe there's some real estate companies in the room. We haven't got a real estate example in this, but for real estate companies in the room, particularly when you're thinking about new build, low carbon cement, low carbon steel. So those are all examples of companies that have spent several years thinking through this. That's what good is like. But don't think that they got there overnight, okay? This was the result of many years' work. All right, so it's directional. Let's have a look at some of the ways that we might be able to get there. And before we do, I just wonder, sort of coming back to the room, for those of you who've started thinking about scope 3, do you have any sort of anything that you found effective at the starting point of your journey? Or anything that you found particularly challenging at the starting point of your journey?
They finance, let's say a car, they finance the car owner. So this is their scope 3, to quantify the car emission, right? So how about the car manufacturer? They also quantify this as their use of product, so product, right? So is it double count for this, in this case?
Sorry, so you're talking about the financing, the finance provider. Okay, so interestingly, DBS is specific about that. This target applies to the auto OEMs, and it also applies to the auto financing companies. So they do expect that the auto financing companies should be reducing the financed emissions as well.
No, I'm talking about the bank itself.
Yeah?
They do, let's say, car financing
Yes.
to an individual, right? There's
Yes.
someone to buy a car, right? So how they quantify this investment, I mean, it's financing.
So that would be, that should be financed emissions. So it depends how it's done. If it's specifically within the auto sector, then, now, forgive me, I'm going to spend a moment trying to find it, but somewhere there'll be, it'll fit into one of these categories somewhere. I'm just not sure. They don't call it auto, so I can't kind of quite find it. But it will be a scope 3 emission for the bank.
Yeah, but then the same car manufacturer, they will quantify this as their use of so goes, right? So this also, they will count emission. So this will double count by these two organizations under the scope 3 really.
So the reason that people start by focusing on scope 1 and scope 2 is to avoid double counting. So if we want to add everything up across the economy, you just add up scope 1 and scope 2, right? That's one, let's say, use case. But if we want to understand across a whole value chain, then we need to use scope 3. So yes, you're right. If you start adding up, like let's take the first example at the beginning, right? Then if we add up everybody's full emissions, it's going to be 420, not 105 each. So when we work with scope 3s, we can't, in a way, add it all up, because then we will be double counting. That's correct.
So we have no solution, no address right now.
Well, we need to understand that the point is that the scope 3 information, when viewed across it tells you how CO2 emissive is this value chain. So the scope 1 and scope 2 across the value chain should be adding up. So it's just that you don't add the scope 3s to each other. You can only add, so scope 1, you can add to scope 1, but you can't add scope 3 and scope 3. Marina's going to back off.
Thanks. I think I see where the conclusion is, if you don't mind, just very quickly. You're right about it. It's a possibility for double counting in terms of if you just look at as a scope 3 problem. But here's the reason why they came up with scope 3 instead of just, tackling scope 1 and 2 for everyone, right? Then you avoid double counting. But here's the reason why scope 3 is important. They're saying that this is a whole of society effort. If you leave it at scope 1 and 2, you're leaving it to a lot of individuals to make that decision to reduce a scope 1 and 2. And that might not be the most efficient way. So scope 3 is essentially putting the responsibility for your supply chain's carbon emissions on you, the client, making you responsible for it because you have direct contact with your supply chain, not the regulators, not the customers. The one who can really exert influence on the supply chain is you, the primary customer. That's why they have this scope 3 category, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole idea. So if you know that, you leverage on your position as the primary client, you are going to influence your entire supply chain to do their scope 1 and 2. And you can do it faster and more effectively than if the regulators could do it, right? So yes, there will be double counting. So for example, the financed emissions and for example, VW, right? They're counting the same carbon emissions, but it's not that. It means principally that there's more than one player to exert influence on the supply chain. So the banks will work with the auto companies, will work with the distributors, etc., and push the supply chain to reduce their scope 1 and 2. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand.
I'd like to add on to what Marina is saying. Right? So I sit on the board of a financial group, and we are very concerned about finance emissions. And because we have to look at our portfolio and see what our portfolio is doing in that regard. And that is how the banking or the finance industry is going to exert pressure. So for example, our pet peeve is that, hey, the entire ecosystem is not working together. Let's start with the bank. The bank might say, then, hey, we're not going to increase our mortgage portfolio because the homes that we are financing are still your traditional homes, built by traditional developers who's not using sustainable material, right? And there's no renewable energy for these homes. And then, and Tenaga should be here really this morning, right? Tenaga is not allowing or maximizing the ability of all these smart homes to feed back into the grid, right? So all these are not incentivizing the entire ecosystem to work together. Maybe scope 3 will help because now the banks really have to do something about it because we have to declare our finance emission. Yeah. So it's about the impact of the entire ecosystem.
Thank you. It's me again. So if I were to go in line with what you say, so banks or financiers will say, oh, we are 95% compliance with regard to zero emission, 95%. But that's not the true picture. That's why CMP went to the extent of going for SPI targets, and they say there will only be net zero to include the client sectors which do a lot of harm in emission to the atmosphere. So scope 3 do count, though it's very challenging. Yeah.
Is there any sort of thoughts or sharings from these tables? Because we haven't. Please.
Thank you. Morning. I have done scope 1 and scope 2 internally. Now we are approaching to scope 3. And the first thing I look at it, supply chain. Sorry, I'm in property. Okay. And the first thing I look at it is contractors. Before I look into contractors, I ask internally my management. They say that we don't need to do scope 3. I say, why? That's interesting. Finance need to do, auto need to do. Why you don't need? Because we are the developer, we are the main con, and we got one group of subcon. So we don't need to do because subcon will do themselves, which comes back to the duplication of data disclosure. So that's why I'm here today, because I've spoken to consultant, and the consultant tells me, you don't need to look into scope 3 first. You look to scope 1 and scope 2. How you manage to reduce? That's pretty confusing. And then I happen to know TCFD is supposed to come in 2025. And I also happen to know that ISSB scope 1 and scope 2 already has been released in June 2023. And there are some sort of duplication. GRI and ISSB supposed to work together to narrow the disclosure. Now, where am I supposed to be? Do? Don't do?
Okay, so thank you very much for sharing. I'm going to inject one little comment on real estate, but it can really depend where you are in the value chain, if you're a developer or also a manager and so on and so forth. In Australia now, the government will not be a tenant of buildings that have a low energy, that have poor energy efficiency. So if it's an energy wasteful building, government won't be a tenant. Brown penalty, okay? So if you're a developer, maybe you're selling inefficient buildings, not you of course, but some other developer, selling inefficient buildings, right? And maybe they get away with it, nobody notices the difference. But one day people are gonna notice the difference, selling price lower. Selling price will be lower. So it's one of those things, you don't know when you're gonna get caught out, but you will get caught out at some point. That's the key. Now if you're, also true if you're buying buildings. You're buying buildings and the other people, they came in and they looked, oh, very, aircon not so efficient, there's no way to retrofit this building. If we try to retrofit to meet the energy efficiency standards, oh, so much money. So then their price will be low. And then you come in, maybe you think, oh, it's a nice price, you buy it. And then in 5 years' time, suddenly, new government standards, regulation. This regulation's in place in the UK and New York, in Australia. I mean, it's coming in place in more and more parts of the world. So if you're an international developer or an international property company, you absolutely have to be thinking about this today, no question. In Malaysia, it's going to depend when the regulation comes in. Suddenly, your building's not compliant. You might be lucky. It might just be you change the aircon a little bit and everything's okay. If you're unlucky, whole aircon's got to go, big money. So the board needs to be on top of that. And that's, however the board is going to get there. Maybe the board gets there through a structured process like Scope 3, or maybe you just make that argument. That's something for real estate. And any other sharing, maybe some of our quiet.
If I could just add on. It doesn't matter whether you're real estate, corporate entity listed, or otherwise. It doesn't matter whether you're in health sector, whatever sector you're in. Primarily, it boils down to the fact that you appreciate that this decarbonization journey is critical. It's going to have to be very fast and at scale. And therefore, you're going to leverage on your standing as a large corporate entity to bring your entire supply chain along with you on this decarbonization journey. And you can help the supply chain. And I think it's even better for the large corporate entities to put money into helping the supply chain reduce their Scope 1 and 2 rather than buying carbon credits. I'm sorry, Tan Sri Wahid, that I just said that. But I think it's more cost efficient. The impact will be much more direct, faster scale. So that's my dissenting view.
Let's have a little look at this supply chain question. So here's a blank chart on incentivizing supply chain decarbonization, right? And so what are the options for incentivizing suppliers? If you're a large buyer, right, you've got the SMEs. What are the main options? So we've got one axis which is financial versus non-financial. We've got another axis which is reward versus penalty. So we can build capability, we can reward progress, we can enforce performance, or we can leverage our procurement functions in various ways. So does anyone want to volunteer? Are there any tactics which you think could belong somewhere on that page? Any supplier negotiating tactics? Oh, are people going to be shy? All right, what about, well, we'll take one from Bursa's leaf. What about requesting data? Where does requesting data go? So requesting data, especially if it's Bursa, if it's become mandatory, then there's going to be some enforcement, some penalty in it if it doesn't happen. And it's leveraging the procurement function. I saw a hand go up.
Yeah. For this one, for rewarding or incentive, for the supplier, let's say SME. If you ask them to do reduction for scope 1 and scope 2, right?
Yeah.
How they prove, they need to provide the data and get verified all that, right? So there's a cost incurred for the SME. How about if the SME, they will do that, they can generate this one as a credit and sell back to the corporate the report for their scope 3. It's as an incentive.
So how would you like to give them the credit? Are you thinking better pricing, or?
Well, based on the corporate, maybe they have their own internal carbon pricing based on that, or based on a negotiated agreement that when this small company, they can do the reduction for their scope 1 or scope 2, then those reduction will be sold to this corporate for them as a reporting purpose, as a proof of the data for the reduction. So at least the small company, they can recoup back their investment for this verification or this process.
Okay, so and then the payback could be better pricing, that's up here, or it could be some kind of investment, or you could be bringing them along through sort of some kind of learning, a few different ideas coming in there. Any other ideas? We heard at the beginning about the building capacity. Sure, go for it, Marina. You got the mic.
Sorry, I have to come up again with this. One of the most effective ways that you can influence supply chain, I learned from the Japanese manufacturers. You know, Malaysia is essentially the backyard for Japan's major manufacturers, right? We have so many other manufacturing facilities here. So in the late 1990s, when ISO 14001 came out, and I'm sure all of you know about ISO 14001, when it first came out, you know, the Japanese were scurrying around trying to, you know, implement that system in their organization. But then within a few years of doing that, here's what they did with their suppliers. They told their suppliers that if within 3 to 5 years, depending on the size of the organization, if they didn't have a rudimentary environmental management system in their organization, or they try or you know, attempt to reduce some of the environmental impact, they would not be included in the supplier list. That was such an effective driver for SME action. That was very easy. And you know, the Japanese companies didn't just, you know, put out that requirement through procurement. They also provided a little bit of training for some of them, a little bit of assistance. Not much, but at least it was there. So you find that, you know, that is a key driver.
So I'm going to argue that, so delisting, that's quite a penalty, right? And then you're leveraging the procurement function. So I guess that the delisting part sort of goes down there. And then it, again, sort of providing some support, that kind of can go in the building capacity quadrant. Okay, so I should say, by the way, this isn't ours. I've just copied it from WBC, SD, and PwC. And I put the resource links in here. I should be fair about that. And here is a map with some of the ideas on it. We've heard contract termination. We've heard about reporting aspects, beneficial payment terms and higher product prices, longer term contracts, maybe more consistent pricing and contracts. So there's a whole range of ways. There's also public recognition and co-branding, right? You know, that small supplier that manages to work it out, give them some position right up next to the big brand, that's going to be good for them. So there's a whole range of different ways. And this can be, I mean, this is mainly around supply chain, but some of the ideas here, they can be used for financed emissions as well, sort of relatively similar if you're providing financial products to clients. There's a whole range of pieces that can be done. Any further comments on supply chain specifically? Sure.
Hi, Benjamin. Let's say in the industry that there are very few suppliers, it's very concentrated. Then, you know, like you are trying to tell your suppliers to like be low carbon, etc., right? So, but if there are like a small oligopoly or what, I mean, they're just a few people. So then the government needs to step in, or what are your thoughts, you know, when those things happen? Because it can happen in Malaysia, actually.
So there has to be some sensitivity around that. going in, well, Marina's example, 3 to 5 years, right? And there it was a management system rather than necessarily a performance outcome, if I heard it correctly. So, you know, giving time, maybe the government needs to provide the resources. I mean, actually, if we look at how Bursa does it, right? Bursa, over the last decade, has been putting out different guidances on sustainability reporting. Typically, there'll be maybe a rule, but there'll be a lot of guidance at the same time. And then a few years later, the rule expands a bit, and then there's some new guidance for the next part. So that's a kind of fairly typical iterative approach to trying to shift things along. But sometimes it's just going to need somebody to subsidize. You know, sometimes the reporting burden's really high. I mean, smallholders RSPO certification is an example of that, where the costs of smallholders certification can be really quite high. That's an issue.
No, I just wanted to add, taking off from Marina, here, this is Nessa. You know, just taking off from Marina, when I was in the oil and gas, one of the things that worked really effectively was actually we start from our experience of working from an environmental and safety perspective is we started rating our supply chain green, yellow, and red. And so as we did this, we are also engaging them, you know, to build the capacity. You know, if they're green, if they are red, how do you move to yellow and red? So when I was there for about 5 years, you could gradually see the improvement in the performance of our supply chain as we continue to engage them and actually tell them, you know, where are the gaps, and working together to build the capacity is one of the things that worked.
So communication signals, the penalty is a sort of a social penalty that nobody wants to be read. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And also the amount of business that goes back to the supply chain is also related to where they are sitting.
So there was a reward attached to that as well.
There was a reward attached to it, yes.
Financial reward plus social sanction. I just wanted to say, so I put in the links to all of the resources and the case studies for this presentation, in case you want to kind of get back to any of these to make it easier when CGM sends out the PDF version. And then I had one last resource, which was for, I just wanted to kind of think through. It's like, okay, here we are with directors on boards. How are we going to catalyze our internal stakeholders? Sometimes the internal stakeholders may maybe even be harder than the external stakeholder can be. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. So here's a few questions. So, you know, do we know where we are? Like, have we thought through the risks of or opportunities? Do we have a plan? And then if there is a plan, or the starting elements of the plan, is the right level of ambition there? Is our plan? So actually ambitious plans are good, even if they feel unrealistic, because ambitious plans help innovation. So you need to kind of get a sweet spot. Too ambitious, oh, can't do it. Not ambitious enough, doesn't provide motivation. Needs to be right ambition, drives innovation. And then finally, no good to tell the business that you're doing something and then you don't put the resources in place. Actually, I had a funny moment in a working group. It was over a year ago in Singapore at RA Asia, and I was with a table of investors, actually, and it was Asian investors, and they said, oh, management has just gone out, they put the net zero target, right? But we've all got then they tell us to do it. We've got day jobs, we don't know where to look. So they were given the target that they had to implement. They didn't even have time to go and find out which was the right resources. That was their experience. So we need to support the people who have got to do the change. I don't know if any of these resonate with you. So in terms of formal presentation, this is the end, but there's still about 5-10 minutes left, is it, Surinder? If there's any other particular sharings. Perhaps if any of you have had that experience at the board level, arguments that you found worked. arguments that didn't work? Any particular sharings on arguments that worked internally or didn't work for scope 3? Did you want to share, Jan? Yeah.
You know, in terms of the companies requiring the suppliers to provide scope 3 emissions reductions, right? What kind of level of proof are you looking to get from them, to the extent that when you do report on your own reports, you don't end up greenwashing? Perhaps you know, you could give some comments on that.
That's a really interesting question. So the scope 3 calculations have got a huge margin of error is the fact of it. Actually though, I'd say in Malaysia, let's go to you. I mean, in the early days, the data simply doesn't exist. So actually it's usually modeled data. For SMEs, I know in Singapore there's a number of companies that are trying to do model data estimates by just sort of going through the accounting system, trying to understand what are the terms in the accounting system and producing some kind of number. So I'd say that particularly early on, you know, you've got to treat it with a very high degree of skepticism, but something better than nothing. Right, so in terms of trying to rely on supply chain information for your own commitments, there needs to be a period. You've got in the data. Good, we've got data, nice start, right? Do we believe it? and that might take a couple of years, unfortunately. It's very valid. Yeah, don't rely on it. Don't rely on the first cut is probably a good rule of thumb there. Any other questions?
Well, no question, but to answer your question, you know, what has worked? And I think what's going to work is if you hit the pocket directly, right? So if the bank says, okay, for non-sustainable housing, your mortgage rate is going to increase by X basis point, I think that is going to ripple through, right, the entire ecosystem, right?
I really like that you put it that way round, okay? Because normally people think, oh, green, I want green, therefore I should get lower. And you put it the other way around. If it's brown, you should pay a penalty. So I think that's more the right way around. Anything else that's worked?
Sorry, I just want to answer. That's how you say how to prove the data for your customer, right? So basically, those data are supposed to be your scope 1 and scope 2. How you make your emission more have a reduction, right? So basically, you need to prove the data through verification, third-party verification, or as well. That's how I say to incentive. Actually, you can generate as a credit, then use the credit to prove to support, okay, to the customer that this is actual reduction. I think this is a better way, right? This is how to grow the carbon credit market as well. I think Bursa Malaysia are happy.
So yeah, thank you very much. Just to share a bit of experience, observations. For the majority of the part, I would say that Scope 3 can contribute up to 60% of carbon emissions in total, sector specific, but generally speaking. And then we have the division of the top tier companies versus the middle rung, which is the bulk of the emitters of carbon. And that's the elephant in the room, if you want to look at Scope 3, from my observation. So a very agile and nimble transition of carrot versus stick plan, which is sensitive to all the incentives and penalties which are being imposed through market authorities, is very, very important. As we push for transformation through carrot, and we are able to inject the stick at the right time and the right place, we find transformation accelerating. Apart from that, I think capacity building and installing the lens of sustainability, where they are able to transform business as usual towards sustainable practices and projects, which give them a better financial bottom line. And this is a technique which needs investment and time to reap harvest, and that foresight should be at board level. Finally, I feel it is very, very important to empower each employee, every human being, to take ownership. And this we do through a system called inner development goals. This ownership then drives and powers every individual towards contributing his or her part responsibly towards the company's general goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Well, perhaps three things. I think firstly, I will lend my support on the suggestion that we do implement not just risk-based pricing, but also incentive-based pricing and purpose-based pricing, meaning that if you're buying a house from a responsible developer, green building and so on, you get privilege rates. And likewise, if you're buying EV, for example, so you should get better pricing compared to your conventional cars and so on. I think that's number one. Number two, if I may just perhaps explain our position on carbon exchange. So Marina, so just to be clear, carbon credits are not meant to substitute your efforts to mitigate your emissions. And let's be clear on that. Now, if you look at our own NDC, Malaysia's position, based on BUR4, the Biennial Update Report number 4, we emit as a country 372 million tons of carbon dioxide. Now, we are fortunate because we have forests today, about 18 million hectares, that's able to sequester 256 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent on a gross basis, right? Now, this 256 is actually the carbon sink. And as you know, there's pressure for further development, and when that happens, the 18 million will go down and so on. Now, it is important for us to help protect the forest. And one way would be to make sure that we reforest whichever degraded areas that we have. Now, this is where proceeds from the sale of carbon credits can help to fund some of these reforestation efforts, including the reforestation of mangroves and so on. So again, just to be clear, it's not meant to substitute your efforts. You have to continue to do that. But in the meantime, do help. By buying carbon credits, they will have other initiatives to either sequester or to reduce emissions. And the third part is about what we can do. You know, I'm just relating to my own personal story. For years, I hesitated to put up solar panels on my rooftop, right? Various excuses, it will affect my roof, cannot support the weight, there'll be other problems with leakages and so on. I hesitated until about a year and a half ago. I said, it's overdue, so let's do it. And I spent 42,000 ringgit to put up the solar panels for 10 kilowatt hour peak. And that's generating, as we speak, 1,100 kilowatt hours per month, right? Now, today, if you're paying your energy, anything above 900 kilowatt hours, you pay 57.1 cents. On top of that, you pay some ICPT charges as well, right? So even at 57.1 cent then, so I'm saving about 700 ringgit per month in terms of actual energy saving. That's 8,400 ringgit per month. So that's actually 20% return. Today, you can actually do it far cheaper. I think 38,000 ringgit easily. So that means what I'm trying to say is actually two things. Number one, doing good doesn't mean that you lose money. You actually get good returns, financial returns. And the second part is actually most important, because by doing it yourself, you actually demonstrating that commitment, not just to yourself, but also to the people. So when you talk to your colleagues, your employees in your organization, you have got solid ground. So as opposed to, okay, we're doing this for this company, but when you say that you have done it yourself, that gives greater conviction and is more convincing for the other people to hear it from. So thank you, Ben.
Well, thank you very much for that sharing. I hope you have another building that you can put the cheaper version and make better return next time. So look, we're at time, so I feel I should hand back to Surinder to bring a formal close to proceedings. But I'm available if you've got any questions immediately afterwards. Unless Bursa needs the room back quickly, I'm happy to sort of be here and take any individual questions. Thank you ever so much, and thanks all for your interaction.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was certainly a very, very interesting session, and I enjoyed all the sharings around the room. And I'm sure that Ben's presentation and some of the participants here who shared experiences has given us much food for thought. We have better understanding of what Scope 3 emissions is. And I think one thing that's very clear, it is going to be very, very difficult to measure, and the data is challenging. And I think the issue that was raised about double counting, I think that's a reality, and we really need to see how we can address that, because your Scope 1 and 2 could be my Scope 3. So there'll be a bit of double counting, but there's a lot of work to be done on that area. So maybe there's some area that maybe Bursa can come up with some guidelines, because I think data verification is going to be a challenge. Because I think no doubt many companies have already embarked on starting on this decarbonization journey. Scope 1 and Scope 2 is already a given. I think Scope 3 is the challenge. I mean, so the category 6 and 7, employee traveling, business travel, that's a low-hanging fruit. So I think many have started on the Scope 3. So if you as a company have started on Scope 3, yes, and most of them will be in that category. But we have to move beyond that, and I think that's where companies are going to be needing a lot of guidance, a lot of maybe capacity building on that part of how to measure. So I'll leave that to the authorities to come up with the regulations and maybe capacity building in that area. I think moving on, our next and final session of this Masterclass series will be held on 4th December, and it will be on the reporting under the TCFD framework, and the speaker will be Ms. Arina Kok from EY. We look forward to having all of you attend that session as well, and please forward this invitation or information to your fellow directors or colleagues. The more the merrier. And CGM plans to continue to organize more events in the year ahead. We appreciate any feedback and suggestions that you have on our programs, especially on areas that you think that we should be covering in our future programs. For today, we would like to have your feedback on the session today. The QR code is on the screen, so if you could just spend maybe 1-2 minutes to give your feedback for today's session, because if I don't do it now, the minute you leave this room, we will not get feedback. So just scan the QR code, and we'll just give a minute to get your feedback. Is it okay? Does it work? Because the other day we had a problem in downloading it, so I'm just, maybe here it's okay.
Thank you, Dansri. Thank you, Dansri. In Singapore, they are trying to regulate everything at 25 degrees.
I don't cycle so much now, but I remember you cycle down Orchard, not from
Can.
You go past the building and it's cold. Could you go past the...
So fun.
Okay, while you're filling in your feedback, let me continue. Can we have the next slide? Okay, we also look forward to more companies joining CGM as corporate friends. Please feel free to contact our secretariat. The contact details are there, and you can get more information about the benefits of being a corporate friend. And also do check out our LinkedIn page. Next slide, please. Do check out our director's briefing on our LinkedIn page as well. I would like to thank Bursa Malaysia once again for so kindly hosting the program today. And I'd like to thank Tan Sri, especially for being present here today. And I would also like to thank the Bursa staff and officers who have been so helpful in helping us to organize this program today. And before we adjourn, we would like to take a group photograph in the foyer outside. So I think there's a staircase there, and they'll flash the name of the program up there. So once you're finished with your feedback, can we make our way to the foyer outside? Mai will show us the way. Thank you. Thank you once again.